Hi, everyone. Welcome to our journal article writing for STEM subjects. I'm Jillian. I'm a learning advisor with Academic Skills. And just to remind you that STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So if you're in one of those disciplines, this is the right place for you to think about journal article writing and how to prepare for journal article writing and see it through the process to submitting to a journal. We also have another session called Publishing in Journals that goes along with this one. So make sure you look out for that session as well. Okay, so first of all, thinking about your answer to these questions. What article are you working on right now? Perhaps you're not working on a journal article and you just want to know about the process. That's fine, but do be thinking about, your general thesis project. What article might be one of the first ones you write based on which experiment you're going to be doing first of all, or one of the aims of your project, and therefore what one of your articles might be about how you fulfilled one of those aims. So you can kind of imagine what one of your articles would be. As part of a thesis, you might have 3 to 4 or 5 journal articles if you're doing a thesis by publication. So be thinking about that scope and how you might be breaking up your thesis findings into those 3 or 4 or 5 articles and be discussing that in conjunction with your supervisor. Okay, so be thinking about that article, that scope, that range. That's going to meet the sort of scope and range expected of your of a journal. You don't want to put your entire thesis into one journal article. So it's going to be thinking about how to break that down into a sizable chunk that meets the standard scope of a journal article. And we'll discuss that a bit more with some of the examples coming up. I also want you to think about what makes an excellent journal article. What is it that you think makes a really excellent journal article? Some answers that I've heard from previous students in this STEM workshop, it has been that the language is really clear and direct and concise. And so how does the language get that way? How do we get clear and concise and direct language? That comes from having a really clear idea of what you want to say and how to get straight to that point. But if you're not sure what you want to say, then you can certainly write in a meandering way using lots of words and not really getting to your point. So that's what we'll really be talking about, how to get to that key message is what we call it, and how to support that throughout the expected sections of your journal article. So some things to think about there. And another thing to think about is what comes first, the journal or the article, the chicken or the egg, that classic kind of question. And the answer is really that both should be kind of happening simultaneously. You obviously can't find a journal and submit to it without having an article in mind already. You're already going to have your basic topic in mind, your basic area of research, and some ideas as to what that key message might be for that article. But you also can't start composing a whole article in whatever way you want that you think meets the needs of your key message, and then go out and search for the journal that's going to fit what you've done. You have to actually think about pretty much what your main point of the article is going to be, and that you have to go out and find the best journal that fits, for a variety of reasons that we'll go over, but you've got to target a particular journal and write for that journal, thinking about their formatting, thinking about their referencing style, thinking about how they display their methods and graphs, thinking about how the word count of the entire article, of the whole section, of the various sections, how they maybe they combine the results and discussion section. Maybe they do a number of different things, and you do have some options, but you want to target that journal first of all before you go ahead and compose a whole article and then try to find an exact match somewhere out there. That's not typically going to work in your favor. So you want to think about what your key message is, and then go ahead and very quickly target that journal that's going to best suit your key message and best suit your goals of where you want to be published, where you want your work to be seen, and by what audience you want to see who you want to see your work. So like I've been saying, there is great support for the idea that you need to have a specific journal in mind before you start writing the actual article. We can often send papers to inappropriate journals if we write it first and then just send it off the way it is and say, oh, I think this journal fits, and then send it off. That would often lead to a desk rejection, which I'll talk about soon. But targeting, what's the best fit? How are you going to decide which journal to send yours to? You probably have a lot of ideas already, but some more ideas would be to obviously ask your supervisors, ask your colleagues, where are they sending their work to? What might be a good fit for you? What are some authors and scholars you admire, and where do they publish? Those scholars that you follow on Twitter or Google Scholar or something, and take note of where they publish. Look at past papers you admired that are those seminal texts for you, and where are those published, and can you think about publishing there as well? Look at editorial boards. If your favorite scholars are on some of those editorial boards, that might be a good indication. A really good suggestion is to join listservs of your field, your discipline. There's got to be some kind of associations for your discipline, your sub-discipline, a kind of cross-discipline, a subfield of yours, something like that. And they announce special issues sometimes for their journal that's associated with their association. And it's a little bit easier to get into a special issue. So if that special issue, if you're lucky enough that it does suit your topic, then there'll be less submissions to a special issue, because there'll be less people who will be able to fit, who will be eligible to submit on that particular subject or topic. So it's you have a better chance, and you want to be aware of those special issues coming up so you can prepare and plan those particular articles. You need to check the aims and scope. That's going to really tell you whether or not your article, your plan for an article, will fit that particular journal. And another good suggestion that people don't often think of is to see if there are any issues or debates you can contribute to within that journal. So looking at the last couple issues, maybe they've been having a kind of ongoing issue or debate or discussion about a particular problem that you can then weigh in on. And that's another way to have an in and to show that you're a real fan of the journal. That's very positive for an editor to see, and then say, yeah, this looks really good. Pass that on to our peer reviewers right away to see if we can get this published in the journal. And then you want to think about your realistic, your strategy. Do you want to go for the top journal right away? What is the likelihood there? I can't tell you the answer to that. I want you to be optimistic. I don't want you to be overly optimistic and disappointed. I want you to be efficient with your strategy. And that's something you have to come up with yourself. So what is your strategy? Are you going to go sometimes it's hard to tell what is a high level, what is a mid-level. Something to you might be a high level, and to someone else, it might not really be. So, try to get an understanding of what actually is a high level journal based on those various ways of determining that, the impact factor and things like that. But also, thinking about what your supervisors say, what you can figure out maybe on Twitter or something like that about the general reputation of the journal. You may have like a little bit of a wrong idea, an exaggerated idea of the journal, and it might be not as hard to get into as you might imagine it is, or, the other way around. So you want to try to get a realistic understanding of this journal and how difficult it is to get in, and, strategize accordingly. Is it worthwhile to format your whole paper in relation to this journal's requirements and, possibly get rejected and waste, quite a bit of time? If it goes to peer reviewers, things can take quite a while for you to get an answer and a response when you could have been, then formulating how to change your strategy and submit to a different journal instead in the meantime. So think about what is the most efficient strategy for you. Okay, sorry. I just want to show you this. So if you follow this link, and these slides are in our HDR Academic Skills Waddle site for 2021. So you can find this link there and all these slides. But if you follow this link, here's another way to get some ideas for journal articles that for journals that you may not have thought of. So if you pop your title in there, when I do this as an example, I pop in an abstract that I wrote, and it comes up with some pretty good ones that are quite close in my field, some that I hadn't heard of. So it's worth a shot thinking about this computer-generated suggestions of what journals might fit your topic. Okay, so Also thinking about your targeting and your strategy, be thinking about what editors and reviewers are looking for. So they're broadly looking for how well your key message fits the journal and how novel it is. How novel are your findings? And do they make a contribution to the field? A lot of papers are desk rejected. So they come to the editor and then the editor says, no, I'm not going to send these out for peer review. And the reason often is because they feel it doesn't make a contribution and it isn't novel. So you do need to show that what you found, what you've done is indeed novel and does indeed make a contribution to your particular field. So you've got to like explicitly state that contribution and make that clear. Your editor, the editor that you send it to, will not have necessarily be able to make that logical leap and figure out, oh yeah, that contributes in this way and that is new. Like you have to always frame and be persuasive around and really explicitly persuasive about, yes, this work is new, it fills a gap, and it contributes to the field in this way. It helps solve a problem. It contributes to solving a problem. It weighs in on a particular issue. It provides a new look at a theory. Whatever it is, you've got to state that. Okay, so thinking about editors and what they do when they receive your article, they're going to skim through it. They're going to just look at these few things like it says there, the cover letter, abstract, conclusions, references, your reference list. And then they're going to think about, does this meet the scope? Is this a sufficient enough impact? And then they're going to decide if this is what, does this meet the general expectations of our readership and of the impact of the journal? So you've got to think about the audience of the journal. You've got to think about how to determine that as best you can. Who are the readers of this journal? Who is this for? It should say in the aims and scope, it should say somewhere in the journal itself. When you read articles within the journal, who do you feel like is being addressed? Is it being written to someone like you in your field? Are they explaining things that you already know? Are they explaining some things you didn't know? And maybe it's got a wider audience or a little bit of a, overlap with what you do. And it's kind of in a little bit of a new field for you. You've got to make those determinations and then hopefully make the right fit there for what is going to match that journal's readership and think about those audiences. Okay, so it's not just your thesis where it goes to a panel and they have to read it and they're already going to be a good match in terms of a reader and an assessor. This is totally different where it's, could be a very different readership, and you've got to think about who are these readers? What do they need to know to understand my key message on one side? And in another sense, is this a fit? Would these readers be interested in what I have to say in my findings and the significance of what I've done? You want to find readers who are interested in what you found and what you've done. And so that all goes into targeting a journal. Okay, so again, like I'm saying, you could get desk rejected. That's obviously something to avoid. You could fail the technical screening in terms of it's not formatted correctly. You didn't follow the rules that were stated. It's not within those aims and scope of the journal. You didn't make the right assessment there, or they think the topic is not significant. The findings are too minimal. It's already been done before. The standard of writing is too low. So we want to avoid that, of course. So the first thing to do to avoid any of that and to ensure as best you can some successful publication experiences is to be clear about what you want to say. That's how you can get to that concise, clear, direct, straightforward language like many of you like in the journal articles that you read. That's how they're able to do that because they're really clear, those authors who've been published, about what they want to say. So how can you be really clear about what you want to say? You've got to know, like I've been saying, this term key message. You've got to know what that is. And you've got to then be able to shape your whole article around that key message. Your key message is your findings plus the significance. So that's your overall findings plus why that's meaningful. So be aware, it's not just your topic. There's a difference between a topic and your message. If you don't have a key message, you don't have an article, so you can't go and publish anywhere. You've got to think about what are my key findings and why are they important? And that's going to determine the structure and content of your article. and they reinforce and support your key message. Like with any academic writing, a journal article is no different than an academic essay, an academic scientific report, a critical essay. Anything in academia is persuasive and has a key message. Journal articles are no different. So what is that key kernel, that key takeaway that you want your readers to remember and that you can then hang the whole article on, because the whole article is about that. One example we had in a previous workshop was a student found that looking at ancient DNA of teeth of pandas versus wombats, that wombats did not have any evidence of eating bamboo as the pandas did. And then that shows, so that's the findings. And then the significance is that shows that those two species of panda and wombat were not ever evolutionarily related. Don't quote me on that. That's another student's findings. I could have that wrong, but I thought that was a really good example of findings. Okay, the wombat doesn't have, that there's no evidence of the wombat eating bamboo. So what does that mean? Why is that important? Oh, it has this bigger picture meaning. There might have been a debate or some ideas that those two, the panda and the wombat, could have been related in more ancient times. But now this evidence shows it's more likely that they were not. That's the significance. And that's all of a sudden interesting to quite a few more people than just hearing about the evidence from their teeth of what they've eaten and not eaten. So think about your key message there in terms of those big overall findings, plus why is that important? What does that mean in a bigger picture? Like the example. Okay, so thinking about this key message, it will provide that narrative for your paper. It should be easily grasped by a non-expert. So when that student said that key message to me, I understood it. It's not that I should understand everything else that would be written in how the student went about their methods and all of their results and any graphs or tables that would follow. I wouldn't know that if I'm not in the field. I do social science, so I'm not in the field. I wouldn't know that, but I could definitely understand their key message. And then you want to also be thinking about your editor and that it would be of interest to that journal's editor and to the journal who represents the journal's interests. So would it be of interest to them? You have to make that judgment. Okay, so more examples of a key message. Character compatibility analysis highlights uncertainty about the deep structure of the human mitochondrial reference tree. Okay, so giving us, they found something about character compatibility through an analysis, and then the bigger meaning is that it highlights uncertainty about this deep structure. So that's one example. They're stating something. They're making some kind of claim through their findings that uncertainty was highlighted through their method and analysis. Another one, proposed extension to Firefly algorithm improves solutions to continuous optimization problems. So they have a problem. They've proposed something, a Firefly algorithm, and they believe it improves the situation. It improves and it helps to solve continuous optimization problems. Okay, so trying to get that key message into one or two sentences there. Here, they're just one sentence. Okay, improves solution, highlights uncertainty. So giving us that, that stance is very helpful in terms of, okay, now you're going to show us all about how this Firefly algorithm improves these solutions to this problem, to these continuous problems. And that's what we then expect the whole paper to be about in the methods, results, discussion. It would be all about what this problem is, how they created this Firefly algorithm, how they know that it improves solutions, and then how well it improves solutions, how this might work in other contexts in the discussion part. Okay, so we can already see from a key message how the rest of the paper would unfold, how it would support these particular findings and what they mean, their significance. Okay, another example of a key message and where it appears towards the end of an abstract. So an abstract would be context, problem, your methods, results, significance, a little, compression of the entire article itself. So their key message there, they do talk about their results above where I've circled. And then our results reinforce that mountain glaciers are sensitive indicators to climate change, but highlight that some are more sensitive than others. So there's, I think, a key message there. They have their results, and then, as they say above, what they are, and then what do those results mean? They reinforce the idea that's already, it sounds like already known, pretty much, that glaciers are indicators of climate change, and then this other finding as well. So that's one thing to kind of further confirm something, but also to get more specific in what those results mean, highlight that some are more sensitive than others. And then I expect the paper to be about those findings, but also how they know that some glaciers are more sensitive than others, and what that means, and how we might determine which ones are more sensitive than others, and what are those factors. Okay, so getting a sense, trying to find then the key messages of the journals that you'd be considering, and thinking about what is that scope? How might you match that scope in terms of your own key message that you can compose? Okay, so now is a time when you can think about writing your own key message, writing it down in those 1 or 2 sentences. What do my results say? What do they mean in their context? What are my results? What do they mean? Taking that bigger picture look. So I suggest you might stop now and write that down. Okay, but moving on then to more specifics about the journal article writing process, thinking about your titles, and that they matter when you've got to put time into them. It's not that everyone's dying to read your paper, unfortunately. So a title is going to be the first persuasive element in allowing readers to become interested in your paper. And that's more of the stance you want to think about. How can I entice readers? Not, everyone wants to read my paper. They'll obviously see what contribution I'm making. You've got to state all of this. You've got to be persuasive in all of the choices that you make in terms of your writing. So thinking about how can your title most clearly reflect your key message, even in the few words of a title. You want to think about how you can indicate the field of research, the results. Maybe you want to raise questions in the reader's mind. Good titles will do that, and cover all the elements of your paper. So let's look at an example. Bird use of rice field strips of varying width in the Kanto Plains of central Japan. So we get a lot of information in this title. We get that the focus is on birds in relation to rice fields. We understand that the width was varied. We understand that the width of the strips was correlated to the number of species, and we know where it took place in central Japan. So we get a lot of information packed into this example. And then it evokes some relevant questions, such as these. Why was the width important? Did it affect which birds used it? Which field strip width was used most by which birds? It evokes these questions in us. And that's what the researchers would want us to wonder about, because that's what their findings are all about. Okay, so that's just one example to think about. One way of kind of creating a kind of declarative statement about the topic itself. And here are some other ideas to highlight your key message, highlight your results. That would be a good thing if you have good results to highlight. But this example wouldn't highlight those results. Effects of added calcium on salinity tolerance of tomato. Okay, you might be interested in salinity tolerance of plants, or tomato plants in particular, but that doesn't tell you the results, right? You wouldn't know right away. You might think, well, who knows? They're not saying if the added calcium has any effect or not. So I don't know if I want to spend time reading this. Whereas if you say calcium addition improves salinity of tolerance of tomato, we already know you got these positive results. I want to read about that. How did you get those positive results? How much calcium? How did that work? Okay, so you, as best you can, when you can, you want to highlight your results, or you want to highlight keywords as well, if that makes more sense for the context of your work. There, we've got a lot of 3 keywords, and managing weed-shaped hole in disturbed ecosystem, if it's more about a process there and what it sounds like. And then when you have no simple answer, which insect introductions succeed and which fail? That sounds like quite a complicated, answer. And so when you just want to kind of provoke a question and make the reader potential reader interested in what the complicated factors of the answer might be that you're weighing up in your paper, that might be a way to go. Okay, so now would be a good time to think about your title and what kind of way you want to go with your title, highlighting keywords, highlighting results, or posing a question, and write down that title. You can pause and do that. And then thinking about that abstract, like we talked about before, you're going to introduce that context, that background information, the issue, why it's important, what the problem is, the principal activity, purpose of the study, and its scope. So that's, and then that leads on to the methods, your key findings, and the implications, significance. So that's what you want to hit when you're thinking about your abstract. I'm sure you guys have written abstracts before, but when we're thinking about submitting to a journal, we want to make sure we've got it all covered and get back to those basics as well. So we can, we can have a look at this here. So have a little read of this abstract and see if you can find all those parts. So we can see those first couple sentences is some context. Those first couple sentences, and then we kind of get a sense of what they've done. They've done some modeling experiments to kind of test the response to climate change, climate forcing. They name their results there quite explicitly. And then, like we saw before, they talk about their results. 2 sentences there. That first one, our results indicate minor interstadial warming and or drying. And what does that mean? Reinforce that they are sensitive indicators of climate change. Some are more sensitive than others. And then that final sentence about the wider implications about the southern hemisphere transition out of the last glacial maximum, getting quite wide and broad, and what they're tying their results and their meaning to that bigger picture view about the southern hemisphere and the last glacial maximum. It's getting bigger and broader, the way that they're framing the implications of their findings. Okay, so moving on to then structure. So we've thought about targeting a journal. We've thought about indicating, finding, locating, composing your key message, your results plus your significance. We've talked about creating a good title and thinking about an abstract that's going to reflect all the moves of your paper. You don't have to write your abstract first of all, but good to see an encapsulation of what your journal article will be and how you will shrink that down to those points to submit as part of your submission, your abstract. So thinking about the whole structure of your paper, then once you have your key message, you can start thinking about how am I now going to structure this? So of course, for you guys, you're going to have to check just in case your work edges into other fields that are maybe perhaps outside of STEM or something unique within STEM that doesn't use the general structure here. But most of you would be doing the IMRAD, introduction, methods, results, discussion. That does make things a bit easier for you guys. In humanities and social sciences, they don't do that as much and they have more freedom, but with that freedom comes a lot of decisions that make things a little bit more difficult to figure out the best way to proceed to support a key message. So it's nice to have things set out like this for most of you, for the most part. So this is from an example paper, and we'll just put down here their structure, their sections. So we can see they've got their introduction, and then they don't necessarily write for this journal methods. They've got more of a descriptive section titles that then go ahead and describe their methods themselves, where they've manufactured the heat pipe and they've got their experimental setup and their subsections. So you want to be looking at your target journal examples to see how they've set up their sections and what the options are for you in terms of that freedom to create your own sections, how many sections, what's pretty standard in terms of those expectations. Then they've got results and discussions together, where they talk about those different findings and what they mean in those subsections. And again, with the simulations and what happened there, those results and what they mean, and their summary and conclusions. Another one is much shorter, the one we already saw. Abstract, intro, chronology, experimental design, discussion. Keeping it more simple for a totally different journal. So how to decide? Your key message is going to determine that. You're going to need to look at your target journal, and you're going to need to consider your reader's needs. So if it's a readership that is unfamiliar, will be quite unfamiliar with your experimental design, whereas maybe another readership would be very familiar, but the journal you've chosen, they would be unfamiliar. You want to think about how to explain it more in depth, but still be really concise. You are writing to intelligent people who are in a certain field and have certain expectations of that journal, and they expect to be able to follow along clearly, but they don't expect to have a whole encyclopedia entry understanding of what you're doing. They want it all to relate to your key message. So I need to understand what you did in order to understand your results, in order to understand their meaning and significance. So what do you need to do in order to explain that much so that a reader can grasp what they want to grasp, which is your findings and their meaning, your key message. Okay, so we want to make sure it's consistent. You want to make sure you've got the same message in your abstract, your intro, and conclusion. I was just reading a sample abstract from a student, and they had a certain message in the abstract, and it was a little bit different in the intro, and it got very confusing. What are your findings? What is their significance? It's got to be reinforced and consistent throughout all three of those, and not change or be any different. So be careful of that and make sure they're not exactly repeated, but consistent and reinforced, so that a new reader who's not in the field at all can say, yep, you've got these aims, you had these findings, and then they're not confused by the time they get to their introduction and you mention your aims again and say, wait, are those different aims? What's going on here? So aim for that consistency. So you want to be able to look at your sample journals and compare those introductions and conclusions and see how they've done it. How are their messages consistent? Hopefully they are. And try to note that language that they use to reinforce their key message across those different sections of the abstract, intro, and conclusion. Okay, so thinking about focusing on the intro itself, this can be one of the more difficult sections to write. You want to think about, starting broad and narrowing in. So the first thing to do when starting broad, locate your project within its field of scientific research, state what's already known about this problem. And then you want to indicate the need for more research. Indicate the need for more research on this particular gap problem. So you don't want to just indicate that there's a gap and say, so I have to do it, I have to fill it. You also want to show this is a gap and it's important that we fill it because it could contribute to solving this problem or whatever it is. But you've got to have that second piece, not just however no one is looking at this, but however no one is looking at it this way, and that may provide us with more accurate results in order to solve this problem. Then you want to think about, your actual objectives, and that shouldn't be a surprise once you've led us through the problem and the gap and why it's important to fill that gap. We should not be surprised by your objectives would then be to, fill that gap in the particular way you're going to do that. And you want to think about potentially then justification for carrying out the study. But hopefully you've already justified it in the first 4 steps. Okay, so here's an example from a paper, and I'm going to reveal the different sentences that make up their introduction. So I'll reveal their first topic sentence and then the concluding sentence. So have a read of this one. The Asian monsoon represents a major component of the global climate system and influences societal and economic activity for roughly half the world's population. So that's quite broad. It's a broad way to start. That sounds good. It gets us understanding this is about the Asian monsoon. and its relationship as a global climate system, but also, the way it works in the world of, men and women in an economic society. And then the concluding sentence of that paragraph, however, the Miocene-Pliocene evolution and driving mechanisms encoded in the underlying red clay sequence are still not well understood. So we've really narrowed in by the time we got to that end of that paragraph. We're still talking about the Asian monsoon, but we've got some other keywords in there that are giving us more context as to what this author is working on. Within natural systems, magnetic mineral variations can reflect environmental changes and can be quantified with magnetic techniques. So they're getting into their methods there, it sounds like, and they're telling us about the methods at any rate, getting more specific. More recently, environmental magnetism has been used to decipher pre-Quaternary paleoclimate history from underlying red clay sequences. So we're getting back to the red clay and understanding what's been going on more recently. So that first topic sentence is more general about magnetic mineral variations and what they're used for and different techniques. And now we're getting into more recent uses for environmental magnetism. So narrowing in. In contrast, Southern Hemisphere cooling tends to enhance the Asian summer monsoons as indicated by modern observations, climate simulations, and the Quaternary paleoclimate record. So we've got those same similar keywords happening again, and thinking about the temperatures there and how they're indicated. However, little is known about its impact on contemporaneous Asian monsoon variability. Okay, so we're getting some gaps there in those final sentences of those two paragraphs, that however, and that's really indicating a strong gap that's important, and probably in, in the other parts of the paragraph, they might be indicating more strongly why it's important to fill that gap. We can kind of get a sense, little is known about its impact on Asian monsoon variability. We can already get a sense that would be important to know how the monsoons are going to vary, would have an impact on what they're saying above about economic activity. And then what they do in that final paragraph, topic sentence, here we reconstruct this history from the magnetic records of the red clay area. So then we get really specific, and it ties in all that they've said above about this time in history, about this magnetic record, about the red clay area. It all comes together there at the final paragraph. So think about how you might look at your own target journals, their introduction, 3, 4, 5 paragraphs. What are they doing in those paragraphs? How are they moving through those typical moves of an introduction? And how can then you do something similar, not using the same words, but saying, okay, this paragraph is all about context. How did they move from broad context into more narrow context? And that's something you've got to learn and develop through spending that time. And the more time you spend on it now, the easier it's going to be going forward. Okay, and then we talked about, abstract, intros, conclusions, reinforcing the key message. Now we've gotten to the conclusion, where you might have a separate section that's a conclusion, that's 1 paragraph, 2 paragraphs, something like that. You might have just a paragraph tacked on to the end of your discussion or results and discussion section, depending on what your target journal does or what you think is best, if it's more open, but you do want to summarize, restate your key findings, and broaden out again the implications or future directions. So we can see in this example, we've got some summary in the purple, and then broadening out. This new hypothesis is consistent with the importance of Southern Hemisphere processes for present-day monsoon dynamics and previous interpretations of Quaternary Asian monsoon changes on millennial and orbital timescales. So we're getting wide again, talking about monsoon changes on millennial and orbital timescales. We're broadening out. We can understand that it's consistent with other findings and interpretations, looking more broadly at what those bigger ideas and interpretations and findings are. Okay, but looking at your own conclusions for your target journals to figure it out for yourself as well. So then pedaling back to your results. So you can write your journal article in whatever order that you want. And obviously we've skipped order as well, talking about introduction, then conclusion. You could write it that way. You can write in whatever order you want, but in order to find out what your key message is, you've got to think about at least your results, right? And what are those big overall results that are interesting that make a contribution. That's what you want to form your key message around. And then that's what your whole paper will be formed around. When you think about your results, then you're thinking about those big results that you found, that you've highlighted in your abstract, in your intro. And then you want to highlight them again in the beginning of your results section, thinking about then what supports those big findings. What do I include that shows that I've interpreted these results correctly, and including those figures and tables where those results can be found. You don't need to say absolutely everything that you've done. It's got to be the things that support those overall results that you indicate in your key message. So some ideas about verb tenses. It's good to get your head around when to use the different tenses. So for academic writing, you do want to use the simple tense range. So that's a load off to just focus mainly on simple past and simple present, as well as modal verbs, as you see in this slide. But using past tense for things that you've done, what you did and what you found. You want to use the past tense, but present tense you also need to use, and you just need to think about the context. That's for always true situations for your findings. If you're talking about like constant truths, that's part of your context, inexperienced programmers need to use simple language. That's always true. That needs to be present. This graph shows, the graph is always going to show it, no matter who looks at it when, it's always going to show what you've said it shows. And then modal verbs to comment on the strength of your results and your commitment to your ideas and findings. It may be related to, as opposed to, something stronger, like these results show. That's stronger than this result may be related to. So thinking about how strong you can be in your verb choice. Will you choose a modal verb, or will you choose a stronger verb to more directly say there is, these results show this. Okay, figures and tables. You want to think about how you can, create these tables or figures or graphs, whatever it is, so you can make your point really clear and prominent and stand out very easily and quickly to your reader. They could stand alone. You want to think about what point do you want to make? How can you make that the most obvious and clear to your reader? So maybe you want to use that shading to make the weight stronger for the line you want the reader to focus on. We need it to look really clean and clear, not cluttered. Label axes really clearly and descriptively. You might want to just highlight the key point in your title for that figure and make it really clear. X increases as Y decreases instead of the effect of X on Y. Be consistent with that style. Don't duplicate. And think about what's the most important between elements and how you can best show that relationship. Okay, the discussion section, I think that's another tricky one. So we'll have a bit more of a focus on your discussion. I think along with the introduction, you would probably agree, the discussion is also a difficult one. More challenging, not as straightforward. We didn't even talk about methods because that's quite straightforward in terms of writing down what you did. And results are pretty straightforward as well in terms of writing what you found. And you've got to think about a bit about the order, what to include, and how to have the best, clearest charts and tables. But beyond that, the discussion part is a bit of a challenge for a lot of readers, for a lot of writers, hopefully not for your reader. So what to include in your discussion? You've got to reference the main point of your study, review those important findings, explain how your findings aligned with your intro, where you've addressed the research question, fulfilled your aims. Explain how your findings are supported or not supported by the literature. So in what ways do you align, and are they similar? In what ways are they inconsistent or different? And why is that the case? You've got to come up with a kind of interpretation of why that might be. What limitations there were. All studies, no matter how intricate, comprehensive, long they are, have limitations. So what are yours? And what would that mean for the study? What are the implications of the study in general? And what are your recommendations for future research? Those are some notes to hit. You, of course, want to look at your target journal to see, do they hit all these notes? What do they do? What did they go through? The longest bit of your discussion will be that explain how findings are supported or not supported by the literature. That's going to be the bulk of it. So here's some questions to generate ideas to help you to write your discussion. If you've not really written a good discussion before, you're not happy with them, you might want to just sit with these questions and write down your answers in more of a free flow than saying, oh dear, I'm writing my discussion now. I've got to make this perfect right away. Think first about opening yourself up to your answers to these questions and how that might eventually make its way into your nice publishable discussion. So thinking about that, what is the relationship between your results and your aims? Do they match? Did they answer your aims? Was your hypothesis supported? Why or why not? Just write it down in plain language as you're trying to generate ideas. How do your results relate to the wider field? Think about what that could do. What do your results mean? What is most important out of your findings? What was confusing about your results? What was surprising about what you found? What are those connections to concepts in literature? You found something similar to this, you found something not similar to that. Why is that the case? Explain that agreement and disagreement. What are those limitations? What are the implications? Just kind of come up with lots of ideas and then think about what are the best ones that you can then add into your actual draft. What are some recommendations based on your findings for future research? Okay, so thinking about this pyramid for your whole essay, right? You're going to have, for your whole journal article, you're going to have a key message, structure, paragraphing, expression. And then for each section, you might also think, I've got a key message for this section. For my intro, this is my key message. For my methods, this is my key message, that these are the best methods to have used. For my results, this is my key message. These are my overall results, and I'm going to support that. And for your discussion, you've got a key message, which is your overall interpretation of what your results mean and their broader relevance. And then, your structure is based on that key message that you've come up with for your discussion, as well as then your paragraphing, leading your reader through that articulation of what your results mean and how you met your various aims. Okay. And then you're thinking about the sentence level. Then you can worry about that and how you're best supporting your paragraphs and structure and key message and go back up the inverted pyramid. So there's some, I just took from one of our wonderful professors, Matthew Brookhouse, one of his papers. He's in the Fenna School. And have a look at these topic sentences and see if you can follow the narrative just by reading these topic sentences. And that's ultimately what you want to do, to be able to maybe first of all write out your topic sentences so that they form a clear narrative of your discussion. And then you can think about filling in those paragraphs. So have a little look there. As you can see, we've got the bolded words that their findings support their first hypothesis, and then their next findings or another element of their findings, because it's from the same table, support the second hypothesis. Some more findings, their variation was negatively related. And then the next one is about supporting the third hypothesis. And then the fourth one is, a little bit more hedging, may partially explain. And then the last one was not significantly related. Okay, so we've got some, it's in order of the hypotheses as well as the strength of the findings, whereas we get the, the least compelling findings at the very end. So that's one example to look at. You might want to pull out the topic sentences of your target journals discussion, see how they frame the relationship between their findings and other research, or their findings and, what that potentially means. Okay, so we've got a few, I think, some paragraphs from the example journal article. And you want to be thinking about, in general, when you read example journal paragraphs that are more fitting to your target journal, you want to ask yourself these questions. How do they review their most important findings? How do they explain them? How do they approach their limitations? How do they recommend future research? What verbs do they use to demonstrate the strength of their claims? You want to pull all that apart. When you're reading like this, you're not just reading for the content. You're trying to read for how they wrote it. How did they move through all of these elements that they need to put into a discussion or an intro or whatever it is? And how did they make it clear? Or if you read it and you get an impression, wow, this is really clear and straightforward, then you want to think, how did they do that? It wasn't magic. How did they do that? What words did they use? What sentences did they use? What topic sentences did they use in order to create that effect in you, the reader? And how can you then adopt some of those principles to create that effect in your readers? Okay, so just looking at some of my examples here, I've got where the author explains their results and their reasoning for those explanations, where they situated their findings, where they lead the reader through the content, and where they point to future research based on the paper's findings. So you could do whatever you want to do your own color coding, have a little strategy for figuring out how they do the various things they do in their discussion paragraphs. So we can see there, they support the first hypothesis, lead the reader through the content with transitional phrases. That is, if so, unfortunately, in the blue, giving us their stance, their attitude, leading us through, keeping us on track and clear about what they're discussing. Situate their findings within the literature. The results are consistent with, we see that in that example. And, their future research could not be tested and also reflect, I guess that's the top one, sorry, explain the author's results, may also reflect increased FORB, could not be tested. So explaining their results. Okay, so that was my thinking there. You might have your own strategy for how to think about breaking down the discussion and learning from how the author has moved through the various elements needed in a discussion. And there's another one, supports the second hypothesis, where they're explaining their results, broadly comparable, negatively related, may reflect, appears to reduce. So they're always letting us know their findings and their commitment to those findings, leading us through, however, at the same level, and they're comparing, is consistent with Ludwig and Tanwe. Significantly lower, suggests that grazing may be less intense compared to something else. Okay, so putting it in conversation with other findings and making those explanations for whether findings are similar and different. So do have a look at your own sample discussions. And thinking about your subheadings, if they are included in your target journal, you want to think about how they move the reader through your content, align with what's stated in the introduction, try to be specific and not too general. Your subheading tells us what's coming up to follow. So we don't want to think it's going to be like an encyclopedia entry all about the particular disease that you're working on. We want it to be much more specific than that, and introduce a significant element of the key findings if you can, particularly with your discussion. So thinking about then at the paragraph level, how can you ensure your sentences flow? Having that topic sentence will help. That's your controlling idea. And then how can you make sure all of your sentences connect to that controlling idea and then are coherent, flow from one to the next? And that's a later stage. Once you've got the basics down of your key message and structure, then you can think about how is your paragraphing going to best work. Okay, so here's a good, I think, a good table of the verbs and the strength level that you might pull from to say, oh, yeah, I feel really strongly, I'm going to use this kind of verb. Oh, I feel less strong, I'm going to use this kind of verb. Suggests, may, affect, appears, getting weaker. All these are fine. You just want to think about the right one to match your findings and its relationship to the other literature. Okay, so you want to make sure all of your sections are linked to your key message. That's nothing is very different. You haven't gone off topic. And that you're using signposting and cohesive devices to help you make those links, right? And so we've got those, sorry, I'll just go back. But we've got those here, that's what we're talking about. Your transition words, your cohesive devices, whatever you want to call them. I'm sure you could call up your own list on Google as well, but we've got them here, sorry. And these really help the reader follow along with what you're saying. Okay, so sorry, I'll go back. Okay, so it is good to know paragraph structure. A lot of students write something that's far too long or far too short. So I want to keep a nice uniform digestible size paragraph of 150 to 200 words with your clear topic sentence, like I'm talking about before, analysis and evidence, and concluding and linking sentence. Not underdeveloped, not overstuffed, and not missing your topic sentence. Okay. So here's our model paragraph. Have a read through of this in your own time. Think about the topic sentence and how they've really followed through throughout the paragraph. Looked at those. Okay. Factor in that time for editing and proofreading. And think about this publishing checklist. Sorry. And make sure you can check all these off before submitting. And then think about this peer review process where, you might fall, being ready for rejection, being ready for revisions, and hopefully getting ready for that final acceptance. Okay, here's a list of additional resources, particularly the Cargill one I recommend. And please come see us at Academic Skills. You can book in online. Just type in academic skills appointments, and you can book in with a learning advisor, someone like myself. And we can help you, give you some individualized advice about your draft and your target journal, if that's helpful to you. So best of luck with your journal article writing.